So I'm obviously not in my living room. I was super busy this week, and it was more convenient to just film in the church, and maybe I'll just do this moving forward. But I want to talk to you guys this week about unity, and specifically, if you look at our culture and you look at unity, our culture doesn't really have that. From cancel culture to people just not associating with people they disagree with, there is a massive lack of unity. And yeah, like in cancel culture, you'll see people sometimes rightfully, but completely cut people off because of things they've done, maybe presently or maybe even like 10, 20 years ago. And that's kind of infected and affected our relationships as people. And COVID was a prime example of this, where you saw people cancel friends and family and people they would have associated with before just because of differing beliefs, whether they thought that they should be handling the COVID pandemic that way, or whether their political views were like this. You saw people left and right canceling each other who would have been friends and family months before that. And then all of a sudden it brought out this thing where people were just cutting people off for disagreements. And the same thing happens with you in your relationships. Whether you're in school or at youth or on sports teams, sometimes we find out things about other people that make us shut off to them, that we push them out of our lives. And sometimes, I don't want you to hear it wrong, that sometimes there is a justification for some of those things. But oftentimes when people are just different and have differing points of view or differing opinions or are just seen as weird to us, we shut them off and push them away. And so I want you guys to discuss this in your small groups. Have you seen people you know canceling others? What has that looked like? So we are continuing in our series Before You Go. It's essentially looking at some of the important things that Jesus said he wanted his followers to keep in mind as he headed to the cross and died and then rose again and ascended into his kingdom. That he had some things that he was like, hey, followers of me, there's some important stuff that I want you to know. And last week we kind of talked about a thing called the Last Supper, and we went over Jesus' death and resurrection. And this week we're going to be talking about unity. And unity is actually something super countercultural right now. It's not something that you'll really experience in your day-to-day lives. And my main idea today is this. It's that unity begins with you. So with that, we're going to dive into a book in the Bible called the Book of John. The Book of John, you can find it in the New Testament, which means it's in the books that were written from the birth of Jesus onward. And John is a biography about Jesus' life, actually written by his best friend John and one of his closest disciples. And so in John, Jesus has kind of had that Last Supper meal telling his disciples, hey, I'm going to die. I need you guys to remember me. And then he goes off with them to a garden to pray. And during his prayer, Jesus says this, my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you have sent me and loved them even as you have loved me. So you might have read all that and thought, well, that's a really confusing sentence, Jesus, what are you praying about? And essentially what Jesus is praying about is that his followers would have unity, that they would actually be one. And in fact, he says that he wants them to be one like him and the Father and the Holy Spirit are one. So if you were at our series a few weeks ago, you would remember that we talked about this thing called the Trinity, and how the Trinity is actually a way to describe God, that God is actually three different people. He's the Father, he's the Son, Jesus, and he's the Holy Spirit, but he's also one person all at the same time. And it's really confusing and hard for us to understand because we don't live in a world where people are often like three different things at the same time. And it's kind of like an egg where you've got like the white and the yolk and the shell, and that's all one egg, but three different things. And it's kind of like water and how you can have like liquid water and gas and ice, and they're three different things, but also the same thing. But it's also not like that at all, and it's just really confusing. But Jesus' whole point is that him and the Father and the Holy Spirit are one, and they are actually one person. They're so unified that they are seen as one being, one God. And so what Jesus is saying is actually that he wants us as his followers to have that kind of unity. And this is super countercultural because our world doesn't operate like that. We don't have this deep sense of unity with others who are completely different than us. That, like I said at the beginning, we have a culture where if someone is different or we think they're weird or we have different views, we just cut those people off or we distance ourselves from them. But that's not what God has called us to do. That God says that, hey, if you're a follower of me, your job is to be united to the other followers of me. And Jesus actually says that in doing this, the world is going to see that he is God. And you might be like, why would that kind of show the world that Jesus is God? And it's because it's so radical. It's so different that if people actually came to you and they saw a group of people who loved each other and were unified and didn't push each other away because of their differences and didn't kind of distance themselves from other friends that they didn't like or didn't have similarities, that they actually were one and were like a family, that would actually show the world. It would show our city, it would show your school that Jesus is God. Because people would look in and say, there is something different about the way that these people who say they follow Jesus operate, and I want some of that. And so in your small groups, I want you to discuss this. What does unity in the Trinity look like? What would need to change about youth for us to have the unity Jesus is describing? So you might be wondering, like, so this whole unity thing sounds great, but how do we actually achieve it? I remember that when I was in high school, I kind of had my small group at youth, and they were a group of guys that I loved and hung out with and thought were super awesome. And I remember we went on a youth retreat, actually, and a new guy showed up on the retreat, and his name was Torin. And I remember when Torin showed up, everybody in my small group started to love Torin, which made me not like him. Because originally it felt like I had this group, and we were all friends, and we were all unified, and now it felt like there was a new person in the group, and I wasn't as a part of the group as I felt before, and he was getting all this attention from the youth pastor, from my friends, or whatever. So I grew to like have a resentment for Torin. Like, this guy's a loser. I don't like him. I wish he wasn't here. And if he wasn't here, this retreat would be so much better. But I remember that I felt a conviction in that time where I felt God really speak to me clearly. And he was like, hey, when you showed up to this youth group, you were a mess and a loser and kind of all over the place, but these people embraced you. And not only did they embrace you, but I also embraced you. That when you said, God, I want to follow you, I didn't go, no, you're a loser, I don't like you, we don't agree on certain things, you can't be my follower. No, he said, yes, come and follow me, I want a relationship with you. And so if I've done that to you, and this group of people did that to you, why won't you do that to someone else who needs it? And so I decided, I was like, fine, God, fine, I will strive for unity personally, and I will be kind to Torin and hang out with him and like him. And what actually came out of that, of me deciding not to cut him off and push him away, was that I actually found someone who became a really close friend. That throughout high school, I was a year older than Torin, and so we kind of had almost this like mentorship, friendship, but we would spend tons of time together. That I would go regularly to pick him up from his house, and we would go to McDonald's and just hang out, and he became one of my best friends in high school. And I wouldn't have had that if I chose to just like distance him because I didn't like who he was at the time or whatever, and just chose to be like, no, I'm not going to have unity with this person. That it's through actually choosing to have unity with him that I was able to change that relationship. And I was able to have this incredible friendship that I wouldn't have had before. And in the same way, that's what you have to do here. That this is a hard calling, but it means that in youth, if you want to see unity happen, and if you want to actually follow Jesus in this area, because followers of Jesus follow Jesus. And so if Jesus says, hey, I need you to strive for unity with people who say they follow me, that means if you want to follow Jesus, you need to strive for unity for people who are who call themselves Christians and want to follow God. And so what that looks like is you personally have to just decide to have unity with people. And that's countercultural. That's not the way we operate. We usually wait for others to have unity with us. It's really hard to have unity with people who maybe don't want to have it with you initially. But that's what God is calling us to, that he's saying, hey, this begins with you, that you have to decide as an individual, like with the people at this youth group, and even the people who drive me nuts, and the people who I don't have a lot in common with, I'm going to choose to have unity with them like we're a family. And it's actually through having that kind of radical unity that you're going to show Jesus to other people, and they're going to recognize who Jesus is, and that unity is going to form more and more, where more people will join you as you do that. And again, I want to say, it doesn't mean that there are some people that you go, hey, I actually can't have a relationship with this person, because some people actually are bad influences or are actually not following Jesus and are actually pushing you in a negative direction or have harmed you in some way, that it's actually good to create some distance. But for the majority of people at this youth group, that is not the case. And God is actually calling us to strive for this kind of unity. And so I want you guys to discuss this in your small groups. Jesus says that the world will know who he is by the unity we have. Why do you think this is? Where do you struggle with unity? What needs to change in your life so that you can have the unity Jesus is calling you to have? Unity begins with you. Our world doesn't really understand this, and it's really actually a countercultural idea to think that unity begins with you and that unity is important. But if we're followers of Jesus, we need to follow Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, I want my followers to actually have an incredible unity. In fact, having a unity that the Trinity itself experiences, where it's three different distinct beings that are also so unified that they're seen as one God. In the same way, we should see each other as many different beings that are very distinct from each other, but we should be one church. We should be one youth gathering, that we should actually see followers of Jesus as actually a part of one family. And there should be that kind of bond that would make us inseparable from each other. And the thing is, it has to begin with you, that you have to start to see others as more important than yourself, that you have to start to see others as worth your time. And even if they're different and weird and bother you, to say, hey, I know that actually having unity with them and actually experiencing a deep sense of family is actually going to show the world who Jesus is. And the most radical thing and countercultural thing I could do here and in my school is actually to have unity with followers of Jesus that would make others be like, wow, you guys are so different. Why are you friends? It doesn't make any sense. You say it's because of Jesus. The thing that pulls us together and unifies us is actually how much we care about Jesus and want to follow him together. And it doesn't matter that we don't like the same things and we have different views on other things. And sometimes we drive each other nuts, but we have this deep sense of unity because of Jesus and who he is. Unity begins with you. So if you have time, take some time to pray in your small groups. Take time for prayer requests. If you're done early, after you're done praying for one another, feel free to hang out. And if you're done late, make sure you go home and don't leave people waiting for you. And we will see you guys next week.